This is the second in our fall series. I think it's called Land-Sea Interactions or something very close to that name. And this is our effort to reach out across ASU's community and our collaborator community. I see some collaborators from off ASU campus have called in. That's great. And this is our goal is to get people connected, land and sea, who come from different perspectives, different knowledge bases. And so Nick Povak's going to share some of his knowledge today, but I thank you guys for showing up. These are once a month, and we'll continue as we build our knowledge across these traditionally separate domains of land and sea. So Adrian, I'll hand it over to you.
He needs to be unmuted.
My apologies.
Yeah, part of our new Zoom management trials and tribulations. Okay, Adrian, you ready?
Yeah. So thank you everyone for coming to this meeting. We have our second speaker on this Land-Sea seminar series. It is great to have Dr. Nick Povak with us. Nick is working for USDA Forest Service. He has long expertise in decision support systems applied to very different environments, like for frame-prone ecosystems to land coastal sea. And actually, we have been cooperating the last 2 years, and we have managed to produce 2 papers here in for the Hawai'i Island. So having having Nick for this seminar, I think it's great. So thank you, Nick, for being here, and all yours.
All right. Thank you so much, everyone, for having me. It's a delight. It's actually pretty good timing to share some of the work that we've done in Hawaii and in Palau. We are just now got another grant to kind of extend the work that I'm going to show you in Hawaii. And recently, Adrian helped advance some of the decision support tools in Hawaii to include optimization models. And so I thought today I could just kind of show you where we're coming from. I've been working with IPIF on Hawaii since 2012 with Christian Giardino. And as a result, we got these 2 publications, both Hawaii and Palau. And this is sort of the cast of characters that were consistent across all of these, actually, and including Adrian now. And so specifically what we'll cover today is this sort of, concept of ridge-to-reef management of an invasive species on the Hawai'i Island, windward slope of Mauna Kea. And then also over in Babeldaob Island in Palau, they have issues with sediment delivery into nearshore environments. And we developed a decision support tool to help address just that. And so, this idea of ridge-to-reef management, obviously, this is sort of the focus of your seminar series. And, traditional knowledge on Hawaii has known about this type of interaction between land and water for generations. And so we're just trying to catch up as scientists, essentially. And, the idea here is that, why the Pacific Islands? Well, the Pacific Islands are, these global hotspots of biological and cultural diversity, and they're super important to the global environment. And in sort of their size and remoteness, they're particularly vulnerable to climate change. And so I think that these are sort of model systems that we can work with to sort of anticipate the changes that we might see across the globe. Yeah, and these and specifically these are compact living laboratories. I love that phrase, to understand the drivers of both social and ecological resilience. And so these are great laboratories to kind of design these adaptation strategies to reduce threats and to model these efforts to enhance resilience. And so you can see that in this image on the right, sort of how we can kind of envision this ridge-to-reef sort of system. My background's in landscape ecology, and I just sort of see everything as interconnected and nowhere as much as these sort of islands that are dotting the Pacific Ocean. So. Kind of the impetus for some of the research we were doing is this, it's now this kind of dated, but this Rainfall as Forest initiative across Hawaii recognize these relationships between vegetation and its freshwater, and it helps sort of facilitate this implementing ridge-to-reef management through different watersheds across the islands to address these large landscapes and the threats that are associated with them. And I just wanted to play a quick video that can kind of sum up all that I've been talking about, and of course it won't work. Cannot play. That's exciting. All right, well, try to go multimedia. But anyway, essentially just sort of summed up what I was just talking about in terms of some of the threats that are associated with Hawaii. And those threats specifically include loss of native forest land and biodiversity. About half of Hawaii's native forest has been lost over the years. And associated with that is increases in population. So there's these large demand in ecological services, including fresh water, which is probably paramount. In terms of fresh water, we see loss of habitat, loss of watershed capacity to produce fresh water. Exotic species that are very poor in their water use efficiency are actually sucking up most of the water and choking out native vegetation, which is going to be the focus of what we're talking about here. We see reductions in stream flow. We know that warming over the last 30 years is exceeding global averages. And so the idea here is to sort of develop these kind of landscape scale restoration plans to kind of address these specific ecological issues across the islands. So the first study we'll be showing is here. This is the North Hilo Hamakua. It's about 820 square kilometers, the windward side of the Big Island, so tremendous amount of rain. We had, within this sort of study area, we designated these about 990 hectare hydro subunits or catchments. You can kind of see them all really cigar shaped across this study area. And this is sort of our experimental unit of measurement. So we're going to essentially model hydrologic flows through each of these catchments and sort of develop prescriptions based off that. And specifically what we're targeting is this species strawberry guava. It was introduced on the island in 1825 from Brazil. There's no native controls. Its main vector of spread is feral pigs. So they chew up the fruits and poop out the seeds across the island. And so in order to manage strawberry guava, it's very intensive. So where it exists, the restoration strategy is to use this hack and squirt. So it's mechanical removal and chemical application to the stump to prevent sprouting. And then to prevent the spread, it uses fences. So it's hard enough to hike through these watersheds on your own, let alone carrying, large fences and all the equipment it takes to install those. So this is hugely, costly and time consuming. So, those are the two kind of models that we're going to be looking at in terms of sort of strawberry guava management. And across the North Hilo Hamakua, this is the distribution of strawberry guava. So where it's red is sort of, pretty much stocked with strawberry guava. So the native vegetation is really struggling in all of these areas. And you can kind of see these areas also correspond with most of the rainfall. So you're getting a huge freshwater inputs here, but then they're being taken up by this exotic species. So the task that we were given is to sort of develop this decision support tool, and I'll get into the specifics of what that actually means. But the idea here is to prioritize management across the North Hilo Hamakua. And so again, with two objectives in mind. One, restoring areas that are currently stocked with strawberry guava, and then protecting areas that are vulnerable to the spread of strawberry guava. And the ecological service that we're trying to specifically address here is this total freshwater yield. And we're also incorporating other things that are sort of practical that kind of go into what might make how you might make management decisions. So this would be access limitations, ownership, costs, maintenance costs, and stuff like that. And then we wanted to know how the decisions we make now will, how climate change may impact that prioritization over time. So we developed, in order to do this, we developed these different scenarios. So this is all within the sort of like a modeling environment. So we looked at 3 different management scenarios or vegetation scenarios, and then 5 different climate scenarios. And they're fairly simplistic in their application. So we looked at the current vegetation conditions, and then we just sort of stocked strawberry guava across the whole landscape. And then in the third sort of treatment, we looked at this full restoration. So what if we completely restored native vegetations across the whole island? And this was specifically to get at this impulse of water that is directly related to the vegetation. So what is the sensitivity of each of these catchments to the vegetation that's dominant there? And then we looked at these different climate scenarios, this wet, so we just sort of full scale increase precipitation by 20%, then reduce it by 20% for the dry scenario. And then we just dialed up the temperature 2 degrees, and then we had a warm and wet and then a warm and dry. So that's 5 scenarios. And specific to what we're going to be showing here, in terms of the prioritization, the climate change actually didn't change the prioritization. It had a huge water effect, but it didn't necessarily change the spatial distribution of the priorities. And I'm going to show that later, but I just wanted to make that point now in terms of how we incorporated climate change and what the effect was on the prioritization, and that it did not change the actual prioritization. And then, so this is kind of the workflow diagram. So first, we modeled water yield using this distributed hydrology soils vegetation model. This is out of University of Washington. Mark Wigmosta's PhD work. It was first applied in the Cascades, but has since been used all over the place, including here now in Hawaii. And essentially, it does a very good job. It's a very high sort of complex model, and it does a very good job at modeling water flow. So that's all I'll say about that. But so we applied it here. And then we used what's called the Ecosystem Management Decision Support Tool, or EMDS. It's a US Forest Service software product. And it essentially does 2 main things. One, it asks the question, what is the state of the system? So it gets at the sort of purely ecological question of where management need is across the landscape in terms of purely ecology. And here, the ecology we're interested in is the invasive species and its effect on freshwater. And so what this part of the model is called the logic model, the NetWeaver logic model. What it does is it's what's called fuzzy logic. And it essentially, what fuzzy logic gets you is you can ask certain questions of the landscape, and it gives you an idea. Instead of saying it's you have reached a benefit or you need management, either a yes/no proposition, it gets you sort of a gradient. So you have a level of evidence that suggests that management should occur. So here, essentially, what we did is compared the fully restored compared to the fully infested landscape, and took the differential of the water yield that are coming out of each of the catchments based on those 2 different scenarios. And then those set this sort of, it's called the fuzzy ramp. And essentially, then what you could do is sort of say, if you were to fully restore my catchment with native vegetation, how much water would I gain? And then you compare that to the sort of on this ramp across all the catchments. How much water are you getting by increasing the native vegetation? So essentially, it prioritizes based on the expected water yield pulse from management at a given catchment. So if you have if a lot of water is resulting from your management of strawberry guava, then you're going to rank pretty high on this. And vice versa, if by managing strawberry guava, or maybe you don't have a lot of that invasive species there, you're not going to see much of a pulse. So you'd have a low management priority. So you're going to be down here at the sort of -1 score. So that is one component of the sort of state of the system. And then the other component is just sort of how much strawberry guava do you have? And what we did is we ranked very high those catchments that had about 20 to 80%. So if you had way more strawberry guava, you were actually ranked lower, because the sort of, in order to manage that, you'd have a lot of time and effort and money that would go into that. So we wanted to sort of get these ones that were sort of in the middle. So you had the opportunity to actually do something in a catchment. So in summary, you would get high management scores if you had a high net benefit of managing the strawberry guava where you are. And then if you had, a moderate amount of strawberry guava cover, you'd also receive a high score. So we'll see these prioritizations play out, but that's in general sort of what this logic model is doing. And then again, we are incorporating other aspects. So here's like cost and ownership and access and habitat quality. These are all going into the second part of the model, which is the decision model. So this allows for sort of the democratization of the prioritization process. Here you can allow local stakeholders to sort of say, well, I want to rate the ecological system, the sort of this, logic model score highest, and I don't care so much about cost or travel time or stuff like that. Vice versa, you might have managers who are extremely worried about cost, and so they might rank costs higher than other criteria here. So this is one way to sort of get stakeholder input on what's most important for them in terms of management, and then integrate that into the model and influence how the priorities are playing out. So in the end, what you end up with is this map of priorities. So if you have, if you're in red, here would indicate that there's high management need, in that you would get fresh water by managing, and in terms of how things are ranked in terms of cost and travel and all that, all of that's going into sort of this prioritization. So where you're red, this would indicate high priority management, and where you're blue, this would indicate low priority management. So hopefully that makes sense, because nobody can raise their hand.
Makes sense. Great.
Great. Okay, good. It's got bombed, but no, just kidding. Okay. So anyway, this is the hydrology model. It's run over 3-hour time steps over 7 years. And anyway, the idea is that you're quantifying the amount of water that's coming out of each of these individual catchments. So this is real quick. This is kind of this is the hydraulic response. This is the overall, across the whole study area. How did climate change actually influence the amount of water? This isn't the prioritization yet. This is just looking at the water modeling. And some interesting things kind of came up. So really so here we're looking at in the top, I guess, I don't know if you can see my screen's kind of right here. This red line is sort of under each of these different climate scenarios. This is how much water is sort of just coming out of this whole area. So here's it's in gigaliters, which is 1 billion liters. So it's a whole bunch of water. And so the winners in terms of how much water is coming out is sort of the higher precipitation, and then the higher precipitation and warmer. So that's kind of a no-brainer. The more precipitation you put in, the more hydrologic flows that are coming out. But then we can kind of look at the difference between these two different strategies. So the fully restored and then the fully infested. So the fully restored is on top. This is how much water you gain by doing the management, sort of completely removing strawberry guava. And then down here is how much you lose by full infestation. So you're losing about, on average, 15 to 20 gigaliters of water just by because of this one species. And the difference between fully invaded versus fully restored is very different under current temperatures. But when you crank up the temperatures, you actually lose the management response a little bit. So these bars are smaller for the warmer conditions. So essentially what happens is, when it's warmer, the climate signal is actually swamping out some of the vegetation signal in terms of water yield. So that's kind of an important point, in that we might expect over time to, in general, lose the ability to capture more water through management, given the increase in temperature, regardless of if you increase precipitation also. So that was a pretty interesting finding. But again, just to make this point, while we do see this response in terms of the prioritizations, those are those maps I was showing with the red and blue, those did not change very much. And so what I'll show is just sort of under current climate conditions. Okay, so these are the sort of fuzzy ramps again. And again, I mentioned that, I won't go too much into this because who wants to talk about fuzzy ramps, but we had two different objectives. We had a restoration objective. So essentially where the strawberry guava was now, you have one sort of set of criteria, and then where the strawberry guava was about to invade, you have a different model. So essentially we're assessing two things at once, where there's a sort of management need to sort of chop down and all that of strawberry guava, and then where is there a protection need in terms of preventing the future spread. So this is just to show that there's sort of two different models that are being used to assess the landscape. And then here are kind of the results of that. So on the left, you see this is for the protection strategy, and on the right, this is for the restoration strategy. So you can see, essentially, this isn't telling you something too novel, but as you know, we kind of show the distribution of strawberry guava, and it kind of, essentially is where it really was heavy, where all this blue is. And so what this is saying is that strawberry guava is likely to sort of creep up into these environments where it's suitable habitat, but hasn't quite yet dispersed there. So you can imagine where fencing might actually help to prevent the spread uphill. And you can see there's less of a need up here for this type of management, because mostly because these environments are too cold. They're just not suitable for strawberry guava. So the environment will take care of that. And then for the restoration need, you can see again, here where most of the water was, where most of the strawberry guava was, you have high priorities. But then there's also sort of this string here. Again, this is where we saw the distribution of strawberry guava, but there's less of a need down, sort of in the northern areas. So this can in itself be used as a tool to sort of say, okay, well, I have limited amount of money and resources. Where can I go to get the most bang for my buck in terms of managing strawberry guava? Let's see. And then this again is just showing sort of how you integrate these different things, sort of how you can weight sort of the logic score that was coming out of the ecosystem response, the travel costs, treatment costs. We looked at sort of threatened endangered species habitat, and then used ownership to sort of suggest that certain ownerships are going to have a higher conservation need than others. And so you can use this this tool, this criteria decision plus tool, to kind of weight these things differently. And then each of these scores then get weighted, and then those weights are reflected in the priority score. And then, so I just want to make one point here. So here we're sort of, this is the end result of the decision model and the logic model. And here I emphasize, I weighted the logic score, so the state of the ecosystem highest, and you can kind of see you get the same results back. But if you were to emphasize costs, or really any of the other factors, you kind of lose the priorities. And so the whole thing is blue. So that really means that there's something going on in terms of costs. And what's going on is there's just no road and trail network in this area where we saw the greatest need for restoration. So that's a problem. Here's just an indication of sort of how long it actually takes to get to these. And you can see in terms of just one way, it took 4 to 5 hours just to get here. So you can see that there's like a big problem in terms of the sort of cost structure and management structure going behind this. So what do? You ask Adrian for help. And so Adrian, this was just published this week. And this is going to be the embarrassing part for me. What Adrian did is spectacular. If I could just stop there, that would be great. But what he did was incorporate this optimization model. And this is fairly high level math from my perspective, but it's called mixed integer programming, and it's an optimization tool. So what an optimization tool does is, one, it helps sequence management. So it says you should go here, 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 and here in this order to get these certain resources, to balance costs and profits, and to get sort of these even flow of resource benefits over time. That's one of the things it can do. And so it can compare different strategies. It can compare optimizing like water yield over cost, kind of what we were doing with the decision model, where we're ranking things, we're weighting things a little bit differently. It uses high level math to sort of compute across all those different dimensions of what might actually go into a decision. It does that sort of mathematically and produces these maps. And so what we did with this is develop this sort of strategy to optimize ecosystem services and economics over this 10-year horizon. And so you can kind of see in this map down here, these different colors represent different time periods in which you would manage each of these different catchments. So from blue to red is period 1 through period 5. And this graph up here sort of shows how these two specific criteria kind of what the different trade-offs are between water revenues and costs. And with that, you can develop a plan. So some of the other cool advancements that we made with this was that we saw the problem with sort of this 5-day-a-week, 8-hour day, hiking in and hiking out, because we're missing a whole lot of the landscape. It's just inaccessible. So what we did was implement this sort of camping strategy for field workers. So the novel thing here is sort of taking a look at the sort of methodologies that are going behind management and altering them or using them as a variable and saying, well, what if we change this aspect of management? How can that influence what's accessible and how much ecological and economic yield can we get out of the woods? And so by doing this, we actually doubled the benefit. So this was a way of sort of capturing more water and accessing larger parts of the landscape purely by a different model for how we're managing. What this model also did was estimate available biomass and growth over time using this above ground carbon density mapping that I'm sure if you have questions, Adrian can help answer. And then we also, this is really cool, and this is actually catching fire sort of on the mainland, this sort of pay for ecosystem services scheme. So not only we were looking at how much money can you get from the trees, we're also looking at if people were to pay for water, how much money can we actually get out of management, and how can that help increase the amount of acreages that are now accessible for management because the costs are now way down because we have higher revenues. And so we're doing something very similar in the Sierras where we're actually using these different organizations to sort of help develop these different commodity markets for things like fire hazard reduction, carbon sequestration, water yields, things like that. So this sort of ecosystem pay for service scheme is super interesting. And this is one of the first sort of instances where someone's actually integrated this into a decision model. So that's on Adrian and Christian and Greg too. That's awesome. Another cool thing that this does is it looked at spatial clustering of treatment. So it's one thing to sort of throw all these catchments in a hat and pick the ones where you can get the highest freshwater yields and stuff like that. But what if you were to sort of create these project areas and sort of combine catchments and sort of this clustering in order to minimize cost? And that was one of the factors that he looked at to look at trade-offs among management practices. And then again, in the end, what this helps do is sort of develop the spatial and temporal scheduling of treatments and identify the trade-offs among them. And so I won't get too much in this. We kind of talked about all this, but essentially what we're doing was we're helping take a really huge problem and dissect it into its integral parts, both looking at the ecosystem itself and also the practicalities of management. And so this takes, what I really like about these decision models is that it takes sort of this, it goes from fairly heady science into application, and it takes some of the pressure off of managers in terms of making decisions. Even if you saw the map and said, well, that's a no-brainer, we know where to go anyway. What you can do is use this as a quantitative tool to sort of back up your decisions as a manager. So you have now this quantitative evidence for actually doing something, and you have expected yields that are coming out of it to sort of help stakeholders also kind of come along with your management decisions or actually help make them along the way. Okay, so I'm gonna do a hard pivot here. I'm gonna quickly talk about this Babeldaob Island project that we were doing. This is a little bit different. We were looking at sort of sedimentation on that are coming from savanna type habitats on the island onto coral reefs. I'll say that this was sort of a pilot project. There wasn't not a lot of funding that went behind this. And so one of the things we're going to talk about is sort of going from a system where you have a high level of resources to one where you have very little, and sort of how DSTs can help fill that gap. And then after this, I just wanted to show a couple of these web applications that are sort of used as sort of science transfer to actually present this information to groups where there's no barriers to their interactions with the model. So it's just a web-based tool where anyone can sort of use it. So, so for the Palau example, Palau is again, the super remote island, about 800 miles off the coast of the Philippines. Its native vegetation is all tropical forest. but populations have been converting tropical forests to these grassland and savanna habitats for a variety of reasons. They've been doing it forever. And what's happening is, in terms of sediment delivery, these savanna type habitats can't hold on to the soils like the tropical forest can. And so it's leading to sedimentation in the rivers, and then which leads to depositions on coral reef. And it's sort of bad for reef habitat, seagrass beds, mangroves, all of it. So the objective here is to sort of apply certain similar methodologies that we're using for Hawaii example to Palau. So again, we're kind of looking at this sort of similar setup. What if we converted everything to tropical forest versus what if we converted everything to savanna habitats? What is the vegetation signal that that we can identify by looking at the impacts of vegetation on sediment delivery and use that within a decision support tool? So here's Babeldaob Island. It's a volcanic island. You can see it's kind of very, very far away from most things, and so it's a very progressive island. There's a very high top-down support from government to do certain conservation things. They at one point completely shut off commercial fishing in order to help improve their fisheries, and so there's just a great sort of model to help implement this type of conservation when you have a very receptive top-down sort of organization. Again, this is sort of similar to what we saw for the Hamakua example. We have multiple data layers, although not as many as we did in Hawaii, that are going into this modeling. We have the DHSVM modeling that's looking at, now it's not just hydrologic yields, but it's also sediment, which is the main sort of factor that we're looking at. There's a sediment module within DHSVM that does a very good job. And then we use these within this sort of NetWeaver logic model again. Here, this is just showing that we have sort of sediment, water yield, and the vegetation cover sort of as these three primary topics in this model. And here, sediment's just weighted much larger because we are more focused on that. And then we have our decision model down here, where again, we're taking what we learned from this ecosystem model and then incorporated things like the amount of effort it would take to sort of get and manage an area, and then other things related to biological diversity, and then this forest and savanna edge that I won't get into. And again, we're just separating out, we have the protection. So where do we want to ensure that where tropical forest is now, that we protect it from future burning? So those would be areas that if you were to remove the tropical forest cover, you'd expect a large impulse of sediment, a reduction in water yield, and all that. And then for the reforestation, that is where there are currently savanna habitats, and if you were to put tropical forest, would you actually retain more sediment? And here you can see sort of the forest vegetation cover here on the left. There's a lot of, sort of the spine of the island is very well covered. But then when you get sort of the coasts, you get into these population centers, and you lose some of the forest, and you can kind of see here in the savanna cover, that's where the savanna cover is. And so there's intentional burning essentially happening where there's population centers along the coasts, but also up inland as well. And you can kind of see this concomitant increase in sediment where you have the savanna habitat. So this red here kind of corresponds to these orange areas here. So this is just to say that there is actually a sediment response, and we've quantified it in terms of the vegetation cover. And then here is groundwater recharge. That was another factor we looked at, but I wanted to show, you can kind of see, from these aerial photos where savanna habitats exist. You can kind of see they're pretty broad and connected areas. So you can kind of see that there is a huge management need here related purely to promoting tropical forest vegetation. And then this quickly just kind of shows that the more savanna cover, the more forest cover you have, the less amount of sediment you get. So it was a fairly good relationship. So this is just to say that promoting forests actually is going to help with the sediment problem. And so this is the application of the logic model to, sorry, these things are in my way, oops. Here we have the forest, sorry, I can't really see the, anyway. This is the protection strategy up here, and this is the reforestation strategy. So essentially, it's kind of retelling the same story. You want to reforest along these coastlines where you have the main population centers, the high savanna cover, and the demonstrated sediment delivery that's coming from those. And you can see we apply the decision model here. Oh no, sorry, these are just the individual logic scores for groundwater recharge, vegetation cover, and then here is the final logic model. So this is incorporating, sorry, this is incorporating in the D and H over here. This is incorporating everything into the final model. So again, you see these priorities for both protection up here. So these are where you want to protect current tropical forest, because if you were to lose it, you'd see a huge impulse in sediment, reduction in water. And then similar down here for reforestation, you see sort of these hot spots for management. Yeah, so that's probably enough of that. So I'll just very quickly in 5 minutes just show these web tools that we developed for each of these projects. So can you guys see this screen, this web screen?
Yes,
Yep.
Nick, we can.
Okay, cool, great. So one of the things that I thought that I kind of brought to this project was sort of this idea of kind of having this tool be accessible to more than just those folks who read the scientific papers or are directly involved with the project. So this sort of again breaks down some of the barriers in promoting this type of science into management and directly applying it to these landscapes. So this is built on HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. And if I can do it, anyone can do it. So there's that. So here's the distribution of strawberry guava. We saw that in an earlier slide. And then this is just sort of presenting some of the DHSVM output. So this is the water yield that is currently coming out of each of these catchments. This is I'm not sure what actually the water yield in gallons. I'm not sure what the difference between those are, and this is sort of the expected gain in the water yield by doing restoration. So you can see again this pulse here where restoration is going to lead to large outputs of water. And then you can kind of see this is the logic score, the ecosystem score. And when you roll over here, you can sort of see a little more intimate information about each of the different catchments, all the way down to how much we're estimating that would cost to actually do the restoration. So, you're looking at, this is based on the original sort of 5 days a week, 8 hours a day schedule. So that's why costs are so high there. But so then you can click on this, the decision score, and then again, the whole idea behind a decision score is to sort of weight these different things, these practical things that are going into management. So here you can sort of say like, well, I want to, weight the ecosystem score higher than travel costs. Maybe travel costs are less important than actually the labor costs that are going behind it. And then, you can kind of go down the line and do these different weightings, and then you can calculate it, and then the map will result in sort of, this specific prioritization. And again, anytime costs are coming into play in this iteration of the model, you see this huge reduction in the availability of management. So this is one way to sort of kind of capture what we were doing in our modeling. And then here is the Babeldaob Island example. This one was kind of interesting. This is based off of the Shiny R. So it's an R package that allows for this sort of interaction of web-based tools like this. It's a little hinkier, but you can see here's Babeldaob Island, and this is the forest cover layer. So you can kind of see where all the forest is. And if you click on a unit, then you can sort of see where that unit ranks in terms of all the other units, in terms of here it's its forest cover. But you can look at the savanna and the sediment. And the really cool thing is, I mean, it's super quick, and the amount of modeling that goes behind all of these things is pretty intense. So like to have all of this kind of information at your fingertips is really cool. But again, you can kind of go down here and check out the decision model, and you can rate, we had fewer criteria down here, but you can again rate them differently. And here it's separated out into sort of the restoration and the protection score. But anyway, you can calculate that and sort of see how the map changes. So I thought this was kind of cool. And these are often unfunded and sort of you do it in the background, but in the end, this sort of ends up being the product that everyone sort of points to in terms of what you've done. So I think I'll stop there. Hopefully that made any sense to anyone.
Adriana, are you going to field questions or should I? What would you like?
Yeah, thank you, Nick. Great talk. I think the last part of the presentation was really good. These tools are really easy to manage. Actually, that's the way I discovered the data set for the Hiro Hamakua coast, and I started to exploring the data and playing. And I would like to say that, for example, when you show the model for the Babeldaob Island, the sediment model, maybe it's not perfect because it implies like a lot of field work for that. But now we can use remote sensing technology, for example, to spot where are those turbidity hotspot, and that's something, for example, that as GWAS work. So that model can be calibrated, maybe not in terms of flow, but like to detect if those are really like the hotspot areas. I think that's something that can be done with remote sensing. So I think that's another link between remote sensing products and decision support. Yeah, that's what the point I wanted to make. Are there any questions to Nick? Hope so.
I have one just to kick it off. Nick, thank you. That was outstanding. I learned a lot. And I guess my question is, I wrote down, when you think about these models, in your mind, what are the current barriers to scaling up? We know geospatial data is a barrier, but say we can solve that. Is it field calibration of models? Is it computational load? Give us some sense for how you would take this up to a larger and larger scales. Thank you.
Yeah, that's a great question. And and so sort of the first of these projects that I've actually sort of led is this one in the Central Sierras. So talking from that experience, it's one of those things that's even back where we started Hawaii, that was in 2012, the technology has sort of exponentially increased. And so now there's so many fewer barriers to sort of these geospatial data sets and things like that. So I really wouldn't even consider that being the biggest issue now. Really what we're finding is sort of the buy-in from stakeholders and collaboratives and conservancies. There's a funny game that you play in terms of what is the tool, and then bringing them along and having them, really what these are intended to be are co-developed tools that you are completely integrating your user base in the development of the tool. So you have them being the customer as well as the provider of these things. So in terms of identifying what are the metrics that are going to describe the ecological processes that we're interested in, what are the targets that we want to set in terms of identifying where the management need is, and then how you roll that up into a decision tool, and then presenting that and sort of using that as a tool to sort of say across ownerships, which is another big thing in that you have generally, even in Hawaii, obviously, ownership patterns are actually driving a lot of the ecology and a lot of the decision-making process. So to get uniform consensus across user bases on what the actual tool is and how it performs is super important. And right now we're finding that to be the biggest impediment in terms of implementation of our tools. And then the final thing I would just say real quick is that it's climate change is the other thing. So we know that we're working with dynamic landscapes. And so how do you present a management tool that is looking at a static landscape and saying, here's the state of the system right now, but in 10 seconds, it's going to change completely and a fire is going to come through and we're going to have a completely different priorities after that. So what we're doing in the Sierra Nevadas is sort of using these very awesome, I'll just say, landscape simulation models to sort of play the future forward a bunch of different times under climate change and sort of say, instead of having total uncertainty about what's going to happen in the future, let's put some sidewalls on the expected amount of uncertainty moving forward and integrate that into our decision-making process now. And so that is a pretty heady concept. And I think a lot of people want that, but when they actually see the results of integrating those things into the model, they go back to their home place where it's, I want to manage this stand because it's near a house, or it could become their decision-making becomes very, very, anyway, it reverts back to sort of some old thinking. So anyway, the idea here is that the landscapes are large and dynamic, and process flows are sort of what's driving these dynamics. So you need to look at really large landscapes in order to sort of accommodate for that.
Thank you. That's really helpful. Thanks. Rerun, there are some questions in the chat. The first one is related to something Nick said.
Yeah, Paulina saying that what is intended next step in both geographies? Were there decision makers brought along with this DST development who now plan to utilize it for management interventions?
So the next steps for the Hawaii example specifically are that we just got funding to go. So one is to do a redo of the Hamakua using better vegetation data and just better geospatial data and climate change data. And then we're also going to the Kailoa, North Kona area. Did I say that right? Kohala, thank you. Where we're actually looking at sort of more fire dynamics up there, and then also integrating native Hawaiian TEK into sort of the decision tool. And then we're going to South Kona, where we're actually looking at more sort of pollutants that are sort of entering nearshore environments through from human point sources. Did I say that right?
And G-Way is asking, is the management costing estimation for each watershed easy to upscale to large regions?
So can you say that again? I'm sorry.
Is the management costing estimation for each watershed easy to upscale to a larger region?
Oh, yeah, I mean, I think the costing is very interesting. From my perspective, you never really know the cost until you get boots on the ground and sort of assess the sort of landscape that way. You can do, there are certainly tools that help get you there. There's this tool called BioSum that has a whole cost structure sort of associated with it, and, you know, getting at travel times and costs for shipping and hauling and all time in the woods and all that. And I think those are great. I hesitate to say that it's easy to sort of upscale those things and transfer them to different areas, because every area is different. And, you know, even just things like the distance to processing facilities can have a huge impact on cost structure. So it's, you know, they're very specific to the area. So that is one of the biggest challenges we have, is sort of estimating those things and integrating those into the model, for sure.
I know it took time, because you guys use like field work to go with GPS, measuring how much time does it takes to go from here to here. So the data set in Hamakua is so great because they made the investment of collecting these variables that are very engineering, but you need that in order to do some kind of practical management.
Mm-hmm.
So as we saw, I think in that presentation, there is one gap in the middle of the Hamakua coast where there are no roads. So then the cost goes like way too up. So it's difficult to upscale, especially for cost that depends on forest tracks, for example. No more questions?
I have one if I can hop in. Have you seen this form of data-driven decision support happening in other regions? Or if you haven't, is it something that you can see feasibly being replicated by other governments and in other regions?
Yeah. Like I gave the example in the Sierras. We're also doing it Eastern Washington, where we're taking this sort of multi-benefit look. So it's not just, you know, fresh water, it's not just sediment. We're actually looking across things like biodiversity, carbon sequestration, wildfire dynamics, forest, resilience, and things like that. So the idea behind a DST is that it's sort of just like a manifold. It's sort of just, there's the logic model and decision model, but it's very, you can bring your own data. And, the sort of whole point of the Babeldaob example was that you don't, I mean, the better data you have, the better the model will be, obviously, but you can integrate small data into these models. So the transferability of this model is sort of one of its main selling points. And then the other one is that it's very transparent. You can sort of see down the hierarchy of how each of these different decision scores sort of are calculated and yard up to the final scores. And they're very defensible in sort of the way that they quantify these things. So they are extremely, and we're also sort of currently developing one for Vietnam, looking at mangrove restoration in order to reduce tidal impacts on nearshore environments. So they do definitely gain traction, and yeah. So.
Right, we have still 5 minutes. One last question for Nick. Okay. Greg?
No, thank you, Nick. That was outstanding. I learned a lot. And thank you, Adrian, for managing the seminar.
Thank you, everyone. And thank you, Nick. Great presentation.
Thank you, everyone.
Everyone's clapping. Okay, take care. Thank you again, Nick.
You.
Really appreciate it.
Bye.